We have already talked about some differences between men and women with respect to body composition and VO2 max. And now we're going to look at differences in anaerobic capacity and strength. And we'll kind of summarize these three lectures by answering the question, are men and women really that different? Anaerobic capacity can be broken down into the ATP-PC capacity and the glycolytic capacity. With respect to the ATP-PC system, if you remember back from our discussion of these energy systems, energy pathways, what limits the capacity is how much phosphocreatine is stored and how much ATP is stored. Well, it's stored in the muscle, and on a per kilogram basis, certainly on a per kilogram basis of muscle, the stores are very similar in men and women. So the difference in anaerobic capacity between men and women is there, but it's explained by the difference in muscle mass. So in absolute terms, it's quite large. In relative terms, not so large at all, no more different than the difference in muscle mass. So if you're talking about something like sprinting, where you're moving your own body weight, then the relative capacity is what's important, and men and women tend to be slightly different, but fairly similar. Now, this is not proof of what I just said, but it's evidence. If you look at men and women's performances in the 100 meters, at least before Usain Bolt happened, and I think even since he happened, but it was even more clear before Usain Bolt. Men's and women's performance in the 100 meters was clearly different, but percentage-wise, it was one of the closest events in track and field. What separates men and women in the 100 meters and the 200 meters? ATP-PC capacity. Now, apparently, power, there's a difference in the ability to generate power, which transcends the difference in body size. But certainly in terms of capacity, on a relative basis, men and women are very similar. Glycolysis, not only is the process of glycolysis a little more complicated, so too is the difference between men and women. One challenge, of course, is how do we measure this glycolytic capacity or anaerobic capacity in general? One of the classic tests of anaerobic capacity is a 30-second wind gate test. You have a person get on the bike, pedal as fast as they can against a huge resistance. The resistance is so high that they just end up getting slower and slower and slower just over a 30-second test. Their RPMs come down, and the assumption is how much work they did is a measure of their anaerobic capacity. Not a perfect test, but certainly what you can do in 30 seconds is related to your anaerobic capacity. And as you might guess, simply because men are bigger than women, there is a huge difference in how much work they can accomplish in a 30-second wind gate test. When you express it, how much work did they do per kilogram of body weight, the difference gets smaller, but is still meaningful and larger than can be explained simply by muscle mass. Another test of anaerobic capacity, and specifically of glycolytic capacity, is to look at peak blood lactate or maximal blood lactate concentration. Now, work in a wind gate, just how much work you can do, is an absolute measure. Express it per kilogram, it's a relative measure. I'll ask you, blood lactate concentration, absolute or relative? All right, well, since it's expressed per liter of blood, and since the number of liters of blood you have is related to your body size, this really is a relative measure. And so we might expect that it would be fairly similar between men and women. And yet, early studies showed dramatic differences between men and women. And we believe that that's largely explained by the fact that early studies looked at fit young boys and I'm going back 40 years, so this isn't sexist, it's fact. You're going back to when girls played with Barbie and boys played on the jungle gym. So you're looking at fit young boys, active young boys, and less active, certainly not anaerobically active, young girls. And the differences were huge. More recently, studies have shown that yes, there is a difference, but it's nowhere near as great as it was in those early studies, maybe 15, 20%. We even did a study at UNT a few years back where we tested the men's and women's track team. We followed them to every track meet, every outdoor track meet they went to. We followed them. And after they ran a 400 or an 800 or a 1500, 5 minutes after the race, we would obtain a blood sample and then bring it home and analyze it for lactate concentration. It was great fun following the athletes out there after they raced. At first, they were a little uncomfortable with giving a blood sample, but they really, honestly, they really did get into it and they became very helpful. Very often athletes will time their race. What these guys and gals started doing was they would start their watch when they finished their race, so they would know when 5 minutes was up. And of course, I think they were being very helpful when, for the many times as we walked over to them as the 5 minute mark approached, they would raise the finger to show us which one they wanted us to take the blood sample from. Very, very helpful. And we found about 15% higher blood lactates in the men than in the women in each event. Now, again, not proof, but evidence that there really is a sex difference between men and women in glycolytic capacity that stands even when expressed relative to body weight is the fact that the largest performance ratio in track and field is the 800 meters. And this is an event that relies heavily on anaerobic capacity. Part of the difference may be explained by VO2 max, but of all the events, this is the one where the anaerobic capacity is utilized and represents a greater percentage of the overall energy production. The men's world record, 140.91, set at the London Olympics in 2012, and the women's by Jarmila Kratochvilova in 1983, when she was from the Czech Republic, when it was Czechoslovakia. Now you'll notice I've put women's in quote there, and that's because this woman was fairly masculine looking. This was before there was a lot of good doping control in many of the competitions. And, I used to tell my students that she was kind of masculine looking. And then one day somebody came in and they said, we looked her up on the web. And usually when students come in and say, you said, I was expecting, oh my God, she's going to be some very attractive, feminine young woman. And they said, yeah, we found a picture of her. And you can see why I put women's in quotes there. There is perhaps the possibility that her performance was pharmacologically aided. And even using male testosterone type drugs, the quote-unquote women's value is way different from the men's. Again, evidence of this true sex difference in anaerobic capacity. And I say a true sex difference because we don't know what causes it. Let me ask you, what limits anaerobic capacity, glycolytic capacity specifically? If you remember, it was from the effects of the lactic acid. It was from the pH. And if you remember, pH caused three things. among them pain. And you could increase the anaerobic capacity by buffering in order to prevent the pH from dropping too low. All right, based on this information, why is it perhaps that men have a higher anaerobic capacity than women? Is it because men simply can handle a lower pH? Well, the answer to that is no. At the cellular level, these chemical reactions don't know male from female. They're purely chemical reactions, and pH effects are the same in men and women. Okay, so it's not pH. Could it be that men have more buffer than women? If they did, that might explain this difference, but they don't. So we can't explain the difference in terms of a greater buffering capacity by men. So that leaves only tolerance to pain. So men must have a greater tolerance to the pain. Okay, that's not true either. Bottom line, we don't know. So that's why we say it appears to be a true sex difference. We can't explain it. It's a true sex difference. So now let's summarize the effects or the differences between men and women on these different metabolic pathways. ATP-PC, not much difference, certainly not on a per kilogram basis, basically because muscle is muscle. Glycolysis, a true sex difference, meaning a true difference even when you express glycolytic capacity relative to body mass, and we don't know the reason. VO2 max also has this apparent sex difference, but we can explain it by hemoglobin concentration and percent fatness. And if we use other units, then body size plays a role. So, although there are some apparent differences, only the glycolytic capacity differences between men and women are unexplainable and therefore attributable only to the sex difference. And trainability of all these metabolic pathways is quite similar in men and women. If we look at strength, in absolute terms, how much can you bench press? Women have much less strength than men. If you express it relative to body size, then men's and women's values come closer. If you express it relative to fat-free mass, and remember fat-free mass is a proxy for muscle mass, so if you express it relative to muscle mass, the difference essentially disappears. And similarly, if you express it relative to the cross-sectional area of the muscle that's involved, there's no difference, suggesting that there's no such thing as boy muscle and girl muscle. It's muscle, and muscle is muscle. The only difference between the sexes is how much muscle do you have. Now, again, we have already talked some about trainability, and trainability is the same between men and women with regard to strength after puberty. Now, after puberty, some of the early studies showed that women were more trainable than men. And they also reported this neat finding that women could get stronger without getting bigger. So people were saying, wow, women are really special. Not only can they get strong faster, but they can get strong without getting bigger. But again, these studies were done many years ago when the boys grew up on the gym and girls grew up in home ec, many years ago. And what you were seeing was trained boys or trained men being compared against untrained girls and women. And I've tried to kind of explain it with this picture over here. If you start off somebody who is untrained, then for the first few months, you will see very little change in size, but a large increase in strength. So as that green strength curve approaches where the word strength is written, you can see that size is hardly changing at all. Thereafter, after a few months, size increases and with it strength. And any changes in strength are related to changes in size. This is for men and women. Now, how do you explain the fact that those two curves are not congruent in the first 6 months? And the answer is that a lot of the changes in strength are basically neural in origin. So your muscles learn to fire better, more coordinated fashion. Of course, in the first few weeks, there's just pure skill, but then there's these other neurological adaptations. Then it's only after several months that you start seeing, several months of training, that you start seeing hypertrophy, changes in muscle mass. So what was happening was they were taking girls and women starting at the far left-hand side of that graph, so they made rapid strength gains, and they were taking boys and young men who had already made the neurological adaptations and starting them out where the only way they could get stronger was through hypertrophy. So they did hypertrophy, and they did get a little stronger, but the women, whereas the women didn't hypertrophy and got a lot stronger. If you start men and women both at the same point of being absolutely untrained, they both show the same pattern. So recent studies have shown there's nothing magic about women's adaptations to training, and men and women are equally trainable. Now I'm going to have a series of graphs where on the x-axis I've just got performance, and it doesn't matter whether we're talking about high jump or shot put or long jump or running speed or whatever. And you have a bell curve for the men in blue and the women in pink, showing that performance has a distribution where there are a few men who can perform at a very high level and a few men who perform at a very low level, and the average man performs in some middle-of-the-road level. And what you can see from these two curves is that the average male can perform or does perform at a slightly higher level than the average woman. All right, we're going to look at the same graph in terms of the best performer, or if you will, the world record holder. The world record holder in the men's high jump is over 2 meters 40. For the women, it's 2 meters 10. A clear difference. So just as on the previous slide, if you will, the average man could jump 1 meter and the average woman can jump 9/10 of a meter, here the very best man can jump 2 meters 40, the very best woman 2 meters 10. Now this can be a little irritating to women, but what this says is there are a whole lot of men who can perform better than the best woman. And clearly in the world there's hundreds of men who can jump over 2 meters 10. So that's what this graph is showing. However, what the graph also shows you is that many women can perform better, run, jump, throw, better than many men. And in fact, there's quite a few women who can perform better than almost all men. So what do I leave you with? Two things. One, other than glycolytic capacity, in which case we don't know the reason, the apparent sex differences in most physiological factors are explained by some combination of size, fatness, and muscle mass, and hemoglobin concentration. That's the physiological. And then from the practical point of view, There's two ways to look at this. One is that while there are physiological differences between men and women that will never change, men and women are more alike than different. And that's what those last few graphs showed you. On the other hand, the last few graphs also showed you that while men and women are more alike than different, there are physiological differences between men and women that will never change and do affect performance. Well, I'll leave you to think on that. That's all for now. Cheers.